Okay, fourth chapter of Basra. We'll pick up. Shmuel, ready?
Yes, we're recording.
Okay, we are in the middle of the fourth perek of Bava Basra. This scintillating perek of Hilchos Mechira. Okay, I want to focus on a point mentioned on Daf Samach Dalid, page 64a. We're going to read the Mishnah. Loas Habor v'Loas Hadus. Okay, the Mishnah in the beginning of the perek on Daf Samach around 10 days ago started enumerating items that are not part of a conventional sale of a home. For example, when you sell a home, there are certain areas that back then weren't used as much for everyday life, and therefore they are excluded in the sale of a house. And the Mishnah on Samach Daled mentions one particular item, which is the bore, which is the water supply or the well in the yard that supplied the house with water. So the Mishnah says, even if you wrote that you are selling to someone, that you're selling not only what you see, but what you don't see that are in the depths, which one would think that's referring to a possible well. Nevertheless, it's not included. Okay, so therefore, when the seller goes on to sell the house, he retains the well. It's not part of the sale. And since the Mishnah continues, and since the owner keeps that well, Rabbi Akiva says, well, because the owner retains that well, when he sells his home, for argument's sake, for $500,000, so he sells it all except for the well. Now the problem is, so how does he get to that well? He has to then go in a separate transaction, go and pay $10,000, let's say, as a easement, as an access to get water from that well that he retains. Now, if he wants to sell him the well, he could certainly do so. But in a conventional sale where the owner keeps the well for himself, and the only way for him to access the water is to go through the property that he just sold, so now he's stuck. So therefore, he has to actually spend money and pay the new proud owner of the house a way to get to the well. That's Diva Rabbi Akiva. Those are the words of Rabbi Akiva. The Chachamim say no. Once he sold the house and the owner now retains the well, included in the well is a path that the owner could now go and access water from that well. Okay? We'll stop there in the Mishnah. Let's pick up from the Gemara on the last line of Samach Daled Amud Aleph. The Gemara wants to understand what is the difference in opinion all about between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. Says the Gemara 3 lines from the bottom. My love b'hakim apalge. Let us understand what is the difference of opinion. What is this argument all about? Meaning, why does Rabbi Akiva say that the owner now has to buy back a path to get to his water, as opposed to the Chachamim who say he doesn't have to buy back anything? Rabbi Akiva savar mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher, Rabbanan savre mocher ba'ayin ra'am. The Gemara says, well, I think what we could explain is that how do we view a seller when he sells his properties? Okay? Now, we had mentioned a few weeks ago that nobody really ever, unless they absolutely have to, ever want to sell real estate. Because if you remember, we mentioned this a few times, that real estate was deemed the most valuable asset you could own in this world. right? And therefore you only sell your land, your house, your karka if you absolutely are pushed up against the wall. Okay. So therefore you don't really want to sell it. But when you do sell it, are you what we call generous, or are you a little bit stingy? Rabbi Akiva says most sellers are in the generous category. So therefore, when you sell everything, you sell everything. Now, you don't sell the well because everyone agrees that the well isn't included. But the easement, the access path to get to that well, you're such a generous guy that when you sell everything, you sold that also. So therefore, you're stuck and you need a way to get to the water. So how do you get to the water? The only way to get to the water is by buying it back because you're such a nice guy and you sold him everything, the house and the access. So now you have to go buy yourself back access in order to get to your own water. The Rabbanan say, no, mocher ba'ayin ra mocher. Most sellers are selling it, they're a little stingy. And therefore, just like they retain the well, they retain them for themselves a way to get to the well. Okay, so that's what this machlokas is really all about. And the Gemara makes a statement and says that Gemara says, by the way, parenthetically, when we have this concept in Hilchos Mechira about whether a person is generous and sells everything that he humanly can, or is he a little stingy and could hold back something, the source of that machlokas comes from this exact case. Meaning, we had a machlokas, if you remember, back in the third perek, on Daf Lamed Zayin, I believe, where the Gemara talked about a case of someone selling just the trees, okay, and that's it. If I sell you trees in my field, just the trees, nothing else, and you own no land, no real estate, nothing, just the physical tree. So it's a machlokes, Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan, if you remember, whether or not the Baal HaIlan owns any of the karka next to it. Meaning, if I sell you a tree and a month later it dies, right? According to Rabbi Akiva says, yeah, you could plant a new one because you actually own the land under and around the tree, right? It's not reasonable for a seller to sell someone just the tree and not the land around it, or else what will happen in this case if it dies? The Rabbanan say absolutely not. People are stingy and only sell what they absolutely have to sell. So if I sell you a tree and it ends up dying, that's it. Tough luck. All right. So this concept of how people view sales, are they generous or are they not generous? That's the root of this discussion that comes from this Mishnah. Now, in order to understand Rabbi Akiva, you have to go back, okay, into the annals of the Gemara and understand where Rabbi Akiva got this philosophy of when I could look at something and I say, well, did I sell it or did I not sell it? Did I include it or did I not include it? We have to understand why Rabbi Akiva always favors on the side of generosity, of benevolence. What is it about Rabbi Akiva where he always favors that side? So I want to bring in two Mishnayos that don't have anything directly to do with this Mishnah that we learned in Baba Basra, but I think we could glean a little bit of how Rabbi Akiva views things, okay? And I want to look at one Mishnah in particular. The Mishnah is in the beginning of Makos, okay? The beginning of Makos, the first chapter, if you remember, talks about Eidim Zomimim, okay? Witnesses that are proven to be lying about their testimony regarding testifying that they saw a certain action take place. Okay, toward the end of the first parak, the Mishnah, and it's very timely. This week we laid Parsha Shoftim, so we'll do a little bit of Shnayim Mikra, right? Al pi Shnayim Edim Ushlosha Edim Yumas Hameis. Okay, we actually laid this yesterday in Shul, so this is a little precursor for Shabbos. Okay, the law is that we know that we need two witnesses. Okay, two kosher witnesses. That is what we need in terms of testimony and evidence regarding all edus in the Torah. The way the Torah describes it, though, is a little strange. It says two witnesses or three witnesses. Okay, yumas hames. Okay, so when the Mishnah says, I'm reading from the last Mishnah, the second to last Mishnah in the first parak of Makos. So the Mishnah says, meaning if all you need is two witnesses, why does the Torah have to tell me that three is also good? So obviously there's some kind of hidden message as to what the Torah is trying to teach us. So you know why three is important? Because just like three witnesses can be mazim, two witnesses, right? So two witnesses can even be mazim, three. Uminayim, the Mishnah says, afilu meya, Talmud lomar edim. Okay, so the first opinion says that being that the word three is extra, it teaches us that two witnesses can render a set of witnesses against them, even if they're 3 or 100, it doesn't matter. Okay? It doesn't have to be two opposite two. That's what the first opinion says. Rabbi Shimon Omer Mashnaim en haraganatchi shneim zomamin, avshlosha en haraganatchi shloshtan zomamin. The way it works in Edom Zomamin, if you end up killing Edom Zomamin because they lied and they were caught by other witnesses who said imanu hayitem, okay, so the rule is that both of those witnesses have to be proven. Okay, the whole maza means to disqualify a witness because their testimony may be true, but they didn't see it. So, for example, two people show up and say, we saw Ruvain kill Shimon, okay? And they tell them exactly what, when, and where. And the next day, two witnesses come into court and say, how could those two witnesses yesterday claim that they saw a murder when they were with me 100 miles away skiing? Okay? That's a problem. Meaning the murder could have taken place, but those two witnesses lied that they actually saw it happen because they were in a different location. So one of the chidushim that the Torah says is that we believe the second pair who claim that the first pair were lying and not where they say that they really were. Okay, that's what it means. So Rabbi Shimon says that the way it works is that both have to be caught lying. So too, if that group of witnesses is 3, then also all 3 have to be caught lying. Uminayin afilu meya. How do we know that if it's even 100? Talmud lomar edim. So if you want to kill the witnesses, all 100 have to be proven that they were lying. Okay, you can't just say 3. Says the Mishnah, Rabbi Akiva Omer lo bahashlishi ela lahachmir alav v'lasos dino kiyotza be'elu. Rabbi Akiva, who isn't really arguing on this opinion, says if you look at it, even though we don't need 3 witnesses, but the problem is once you introduce this third leg, so to speak, this third wheel that's not really necessary, it makes things tougher. Okay? Meaning that if you want to kill them, then they all have to be proven. Okay? So it doesn't make anything more lenient. Okay? Rather, what ends up happening is that we're more stringent regarding the halachic status of these two witnesses who testify, right? Meaning the two witnesses can claim, right? Hey, we didn't need this person, right? So this person is like I said, a third leg. But once he comes around, he's essential. And now they're all judged together. Okay, so this is a very halachic discussion. Okay, Rabbi Akiva, though, and he's the man of the night, says the following statement. And by the way, the imken anashakasav lanitba la'over yavera ka'over yavera. And if you're punishing this third wheel, who's not really necessary for testimony, as we just said, but because he got involved and now he becomes essential, as if he's now part of the group, lachas kama v'kama, yishalom sachar lenitba la'osei mitzvah ka'osei mitzvah. Could you imagine how much more someone who gets credit, who's part of a group that's doing a mitzvah, and he's not really involved, but because he's part of that group, he becomes like someone really doing the mitzvah. All right? And to put it in the words of the, when this is mentioned, when this Mishnah is mentioned in Avos Durav Nasan, okay, which happens to be a similar teaching to Pirkei Avos, the Avos Durav Nasan says, let me open it up. He says, Rabbi Akiva Omer Kol HaMedabek Ba'over Yaveira, Afal Pi Shalo Asa Kamasehem, Hareza Makabel Paranus. If you hang out with bad people, even if you don't act like them, Hareza Makabel Paranus, you still receive the punishment. Kiyop Tzabehen, B'chol HaMedabek Ba'osei Mitzvah, Afal Pi Shalo Asa Kamasehem, Hareza Makabel Schar. But when it comes to the opposite, when it comes to doing good, okay, he doesn't say kal v'chomer here. He said a kal v'chomer in the Mishnah in Makos, but here he says if you hang out with good people, then through osmosis they'll rub off on you, and you will get the schar, even if you didn't partake in that mitzvah per se. And then Avos Rav Nasan says Keitzad Shnai Me'idin Be'echad, and then it brings in the Mishnah in Makos. Okay. By the way, what does this mean that the midah of the Paranios, right? What did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah in Makos said, Yeshalem schar lenitba la'osei mitzvah k'osei mitzvah. So Rashi in Makos says, because the schar that is you get for good is much more than the schar for bad. What does that mean? That means that the midah of Paranios, the way God punishes us is X, but the reward that we get is X to the 10th power. Okay? So how do we know that concept? We know that concept from the Gemara in Yuma, Daf Ayin Vav. Gemara says, V'chi'eze mida meruba, mida tova or Paranios, is the attribute of goodness, okay, more, or the attribute of Paranios, or punishment and retribution, is that more? So the Gemara says, Haveyomer mida tova midas Paranios. Tova, good, trumps evil. Excuse me, how do you know? The midah Paranios who Omer, it says when it comes to punishment, Va'arubos hashamayim niftachu. The source, which is a very interesting source, the source comes from Noach. When it comes to the flood, it says that the windows in the skies opened and rain came through. The midah tova hu Omer. However, when it comes to the midah tova, such as when God gave us man, which is the opposite of him giving us flood, right? That's midah Paranus, midah tova, right? The attribute of goodness. How much did God give good? By Yitzhak, so it quotes a pasuk where it says, "V'dalte shamayim pesach layam ta'alehem man la'ochel." The pasuk in Tehillim says that the doors of heaven opened, and the Gemara goes on to say how much more volume is created from a door versus a window, and it goes into the whole calculation of how much rain fell that destroyed the world versus how much man fell that sustained the world. So we see that the midah tova is great. much greater than the midah of bad. What does this have to do with anything? This has to do with the fact that we're learning a halacha about Edom Zomamin, and Rabbi Akiva, out of left field, turns a halachic discussion, okay, into an agadic discussion with a little twist of, we'll call it optimism, meaning, and by the way, I'm teaching you a halacha, but you should know that Edom Zomim is a really bad thing because it could lead to two people dying. But if you spin it a little bit, you'll get something optimistic out of that. All right. Such as learning that Midah Tova, okay, is much better than Midah Paranios. That's one Mishnah. The second Mishnah that I'm going to pluck out of left field comes from Bava Kama. And we had this, by the way, 6-7 months ago when we were learning the 8th parak called Hachovel. The Mishnah says, "Hatokel lachaver nosen losel Rabbi Yehuda Omer Mishud Rabbi Yosef Glili Mana." Okay, the 8th parak of Bava Kama talks about tort cases and damages and personal injury law, if you remember. And we actually had a class on this on a Tuesday night about embarrassment. I think it was like toward the end of January or something like that. So the law is that if I slap someone, I have to pay a certain fine, a certain penalty, matayim zuz. If I slap him lachayado in the back of my hand, tsarim ba'ozno. If I pull his ear, if I pull his hair, if I spit at him. Okay. So the Mishnah says, Hara Rosha Isha Bashuk Nosan Arba Meos Zuz Hakla Hakola Fichvodo. There are penalties, but the Tanakama says that the principle of how you pay these payments for humiliation, it's all according to the kavod of the one who was embarrassed. Right? We discussed this back then. That depending on your value, depending on your social status, that's how much the penalty was paid. Says Rabbi Akiva, I'm a Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says no. Rabbi Akiva over here is more liberal. Okay. He says, Afilu anim shabi Yisrael roano san ki'ilu hen b'nei chor and shiyardu min chasehen shehen b'nei Avraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov. Rabbi Akiva disagrees, and he says we're all created equal. If I humiliate a homeless person, is the same penalty as if I humiliate the mayor of the city. Even though one is higher up on the social scale, we're all at the end of the day created equal. So that's what Rabbi Akiva should have said, that we're all equal. Instead, he gives a whole nice pshetel about how even poor people, you have to look at them as though they had money and then they lost it. But after all, they come from the same lineage as me and you. Shem b'nei Avram, they're the sons of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, we're all Jews. So he could have said a statement very terse. But no, he goes on and he provides a whole discussion about how, we're all equal and we're all this. So I think this is another way where he takes a strict, again, this Mishnah is not Agadata, this Mishnah is halacha. This is Choshen Mishpat law, right? Personal injury law. So he takes a statement that he could have said, no, we're all fines and all penalties are the same. Whoever gets humiliated, doesn't matter. And he goes on a whole discussion about how we're all created equal, we're all sons of Avraham. He could just make a statement very, very short. I think we see from these two Mishnayos a little opening into the philosophy of specifically Rabbi Akiva. Now, if that weren't enough, we are going to look at 4 Gemaras, okay, that support this optimistic viewpoint of Rabbi Akiva. Okay, you can't learn this sugya without learning the Gemara in Brachos. Okay, because that starts off this discussion. Gemara in Brachos, Daf Samach Amud Aleph. I'll open it up here. Says the following. Rabbi Akiva was famous. The Gemara goes on to say, hold on, find it. Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav Mishum Rav Meir, v'chen Tana Mishmei de Rabbi Akiva. La'olam yehei ragil lomar kol da'avid Rahman latav avid. Okay? Rabbi Akiva was famous for saying that everything that happens, God does for the best. Okay, this is a story we all learned. I think there was even a children's book written about it. Kihad Rabbi Akiva habe ka'azal ba'orcha. Rabbi Akiva was walking along the road one day. Matalahi masa. He came to a certain city. Ba'yushpizi lo yahavle. Okay, he wanted to stay overnight in the motel, but they didn't give him many rooms left. There were no rooms left for him. Amar called David Rahman al-Atav. He says, all for the best. Azel ubas bedabra, so he had no place to stay. So what did he do? So he slept outside in the field. He had three things with him. He had a rooster, a donkey, and a candle. Okay, Rashi says he had a rooster as an alarm clock. Asazika kabi l'shraga, right? You need light at night also. They didn't have Shabbos lamps, so he needed his lights. The problem is the wind came, blew out the lights. Asa shrunra achal tarnagola. He lost his chicken because the cat ate it. Asa arye achal lachamra. Okay, and the lion came and ate. I'm sorry, a cat came and ate his chicken. Asa arye achal lachamra. I'm sorry, I skipped that line. And a lion came and ate the donkey. Okay, Amar called the Avid Rahman al-Latav. He said his line. It happened to be that night there was an army that invaded the city and took all the people as hostages. Shavi Lamasya. They took the whole city into captivity. Turns out that Rabbi Akiva was not in the city, right? And he had no candle to be noticed. He had no noisy rooster to give away his location, and therefore he was saved. Right? Don't you see from here that everything that God does is for good? Okay? If I have a choice how to react to a situation and I see, was it good or was it for the not good? In Rabbi Akiva's world, okay, he says you always have to look at the positive side. Okay, that is Rabbi Akiva number one. Let us look at now, where did Rabbi Akiva get this philosophy from? So if you remember the Gemara in Tainus, Daf Chaf Aleph, I believe. Chaf Aleph is the Daf where it talks about Nacham Ish Gamzu. Okay, there was a person by the name of Nacham Ish Gamzu. The Gemara says on 21a in Tainus, I'm not going to go through the whole story, but if you remember why what happened to Nacham Ish Gamzu, okay, he didn't react enough. He didn't react, and he cursed himself, and he ended up staying in a house all by himself. He lost his arms and his whole body, and he was in really, really gahaktetzaris. And one of the things that he said was that everything gamzu latova. Okay, we all know this. We all know this story. And the Gemara says, "Oh, my karle nacham ish gamzu to call milsa to have a salkale amur gamzu latova." Okay, I'm not going to go into this story, but Nachman ish gamzu before Rabbi Akiva had a similar statement of gamzu latova. Okay, now what's the connection between Nacham Ish Gamzu and Rabbi Akiva? Yeah, those are two independent stories where they each looked at the glass half full. The connection, though, that connects these two Gemaras is a little known Gemara in Chagiga Daf Yud Beis that says that Rabbi Akiva was actually a student of Nachum Gamzu for 22 years. So that's what connects these two Gemaras together. All right, so we have these two Gemaras that, in my opinion, and there's a lot of editorializing one could do over here about how to analyze this, especially today and today's world. And you could argue that it's a very difficult and dangerous philosophy, because there's horror stories every day. Just turn on the TV, open up your WhatsApp, and just to react and say, oh, look at the glass half full and latav of it and gamzu latova. It doesn't really play out well today, and I'll tell you why it's dangerous, because there's a fascinating medrash I saw. This has to do with, believe it or not, this has to do with a pasuk in Miketz. The story when Yosef is already established in Mitzrayim, and he sends the brothers back after, remember in Miketz where he gives them a hard time, he calls them spies, and he says, take food, and I'm not going to give you more food unless you bring back Binyamin. So what happened? The brothers go back home, and they tell their father what happened. And he says, yeah, we met this king. He was mean to us. He wants us to bring back, little Binyamin. Perek Membeis, Pasuk 36. Vayamar Alehem Yaakov Avihem, Oti shikaltem. You always cause misery. Yosef einenu, v'Shimon einenu, v'Benyamin tikachu alai hayu kulana. So Yaakov says when he hears that the only way is to bring Binyamin, he just loses it. He says, Joseph, right? I lost Joseph. I don't have Shimon anymore, because they told him that Shimon is now in jail, right? And now you're going to take Binyamin, who's young, who's too young to travel. Why do all these bad things happen to me? Okay, that's what Yaakov says. If you look in the Yalkut Shimoni says something fascinating. He says, Vayomer Yisrael, Lama Hariotomi, why do all these bad things happen to me? Says the Medrash, Ma'olam lo Amar Yaakov Avinu Dabar Shel Batala. Yaakov never ever misspoke. So how could he be wrong? Elakacha Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, says God to himself almost in a laughing way, Ani asuk lahamlich es beno b'Mitzrayim. I am bending over backwards to create a narrative where Yosef goes from a nothing to becoming the head, to becoming, right, the second in command of one of the most important countries in the world. And you're complaining? You have any idea what's going on? And then the Medrash goes on to say, Shimon, right? He thinks Shimon is in trouble. You know what Rashi says, by the way, earlier in Perek Mem Beis? The pasuk says, "Vaydaber alehem vayikach meitam es Shimon vayasor tolenem." You remember the story where Shimon is in jail? You think Shimon was really in jail? Says Rashi, "Lo asru ela le'eineihem." Shimon was in jail for a minute. The Kivan Sheyatsu, when they brothers went back to Yaakov in Canaan, Hotziu v'hechilu v'hishku, they took Shimon out of jail and they gave him food and drink. Okay? So God is saying to himself, Yaakov, you're looking at a tiny picture. You don't have the privilege in knowing what I know. All right? So that's, I think, a very important message to really put over here in this discussion about how when we're looking at something, and if you analyze it at that particular minute, it looks disastrous. Yaakov is about to have a heart attack and keel over when he thinks he's losing, 25% of his children in one fell swoop. Meanwhile, if he just waits and sits back and let the rest of the, movie play, he would certainly have a different. The problem with this philosophy is that we're all human beings, right? This is a similar story. this medrash, what it reminded me of is a Gemara in Nida. We actually quoted this way back when. Gemara says, the Gemara, I'm in Nida, Daf Lamed Aleph. Darash Rabbi Yossi Haglili. My dechsev, I'm sorry. Darash Rabbi Yosef. My dechsev otacha Hashem ki anafta bi yashuv abcha b'tenachemi. Okay, you were angry at me, and then I was consoled. Two people go out into the business world. They were about to embark on a trip to make money. As they were about to go onto the boat, one of them got a thorn in their foot, and one of them had to cancel his trip. Okay, this is the Gemara. This isn't a story. Hitchil mecharuf megadef. The person started cursing and saying, "I can't believe you didn't give me this opportunity to make money," and he curses God. Liyamim. A week later, shama shetavos finaso shel chaver biyam. He heard that the boat that he was about to go on with that other person sunk in the water. Hitchil modeh u'mishabeach. All of a sudden, he changes his tune. Right? He's saying Hallel. That's what the pasuk means. Right? Turn your wrath and now console. This reminds me of the story I read about 3 weeks ago. Right? I don't know how. I mean, the news cycle changes almost hourly, but there was a really horrible plane crash in Brazil. I think it was like August 15th or August 16th. And I think 67 people were killed. And the next day, I saw a headline from one of the newspapers is that there were 12 people that did not make that flight that were sent to the wrong gate, and they had a whole ruckus in the airport. They wanted to go on the plane, and the people in the airport did not let them on the plane, and they made a whole production out of it. In the end, they were all, very, very visibly upset. That was until they found out 2 hours later that the plane crashed. So that reminds me of this exact Gemara in Nida Daf Lamed Aleph. So that's why, I think it's very important to realize that, yes, we did see the medrash that says you can't, don't look at that moment, but then again, this kol da'avad Rahman al-Taba of it is a very, very dangerous, way of looking at things. You can't, it's like you go into a shiva house, and the first thing you tell the person sitting shiva is Gamzula Tova. Would anybody have the chutzpah to say such a thing like that? Obviously not. So Rabbi Akiva, you have to ask yourself, why specifically is this Rabbi Akiva? I think his philosophy of looking at things optimistically and the glass half full certainly emanates from his origins. He was a nothing, right? Not only was he poor, he was a ger. He didn't know anything. So a lot of it is, kind of in the, I've seen the worst of it. It can't really get much worse. So
Wait. Rabbi Akiva was not a ger.
He came from a family. Yeah, his father
He came from a ger.
That's what I said. He came from a ger.
But he wasn't a ger himself.
No, I misspoke. I said he came from a ger, right? So came from a ger. He was downtrodden. He knew nothing. He was an Ama Aretz, and he was poor, right? If you remember the Gemara in Ksuvas talks about how poor he was when he got married. He needed the help of his father-in-law, and even that didn't end up good. So, right, and then we had why Rabbi Akiva became rich, but I think that that very modest beginning, turns into this whole philosophy of I've seen the worst, let's look at, the bright side of things. So we saw so far, just to synopsize, we saw two Mishnayos that Rabbi Akiva turned into nice, agadic statements that were pure halachic statements that were very, very, on the optimistic side, the one in Makos, the one in Bava Kama. We saw his origin of kol da'avad Rahman al-Tav, everything is for good. There are two other Gemaras that you thought that I was going to quote by now that I didn't. because these are the famous, laughing versus crying Gemaras. One of them takes the cake at the end of Makos, but there's one that's not really well known, and that is the Gemara in Sanhedrin. Okay, let's open it up. The Gemara is in Sanhedrin Daf Kuf Aleph. Okay, Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Kuf Aleph relates the story. Up, hold on. Amar Rabba Babarchana, I am in 101a Sanhedrin. If you're following along, Kuf Aleph Amid Aleph. Kishachal Rabbi Eliezer nichnusu talmid of Levakro. When Rabbi Eliezer became sick, this is the famous Rabbi Eliezer who we learned about in Bava Metzia, Nun Tes, the story of Tanu Rachnai, who was put in Cherem. Nichnusu talmid of Levakro. But this came before that story. So when he became sick, his students came to visit him. Amar Lahan, he said to his students, Chama aza yesh ba'olam. God must really be upset. Hitchilu hen bochen Rabbi Akiva mesachik. So some of the students were crying. Rabbi Akiva decided to laugh. Amar lo lama ta mesachek. Amar lahan yuchim tam bochen. They each looked at each other and wanted to know why they were reacting the way they were. Amar lo, they said to him, Efshar sefer Torah shari b'tzar v'lo nivke. So they said, the majority of the students said, I'll tell you why I'm crying. We have a living Sefer Torah. Okay? Elsewhere, the Gemara in Makos says that Talmidei Chachamim are compared to living Sefer Torah. Right? If you remember, Kama Tipshay Hani Bavloi, that Gemara. So here we have a living Sefer Torah that is in pain, and we're not going to cry. So says Rabbi Akiva, Lakachani Mesachik, because that's exactly why I'm happy. That basically means when I saw my Rebbe, okay, just skating through life, unaffected, right? His wine didn't spoil, his honey didn't spoil, all these things, right? He was cruising, as they say today. I would say to myself, big deal. Shema Chas Hashem Kiba Rabbi Olamo. Yeah, you know why he's not, everything is going great? Because he's getting his schar now, as opposed to when it really counts, which is later. Now that I see Rebbe in pain, it brings me happiness. Again, to be on this level, to say this, that's why it's very hard for us to relate, which goes back to what I said a few minutes ago of it's very hard to accept things when they happen and say, oh, this person was killed, I was injured, all these bad things are happening, just accept it and say that it's for the good. Okay, when people go through this, that's the last thing they want to hear. And I can tell that to you on a personal note. So the Gemara says Rabbi Akiva, again, on his level, I'm happy that he's suffering because that means that he's going to get his ultimate reward. Okay? Amrlo Akiva, klum chisarti min Torah kula. So Rabbi Eliezer said, why should I be suffering? What did I do wrong? Did I sin? Right? Is there something I'm lacking? Amarlo, he says, maybe. Didn't you teach us? Ki Adam ein sadik ba'aretz asher yasa tov v'lo yechta? What do you think? You're perfect? He must have done something wrong. So that's the way the story ends. There's a lot to be said on the story. Hopefully we'll get to it next year when we learn Sanhedrin. The point of the story is, this is illustration number 1, where we have the optimistic Rabbi Akiva, where he is, laughing or smiling when everybody else around him is crying. We're now going to look at the one that everybody knows. This is one of those 9 days Siyum Gemaras that everybody remembers. It's all the way at the end of Maseches Makot, page 24a, Chav Daled Amud Aleph on the bottom. There's actually 2 stories. Most people quote the second story, but we're going to quote both of them. Okay? Ukvar Haya Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Elazar ben Azar, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Akiva. Okay, this isn't from the Haggadah. Mahalchan Baderech. Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Lezer, and Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Akiva were all going, presumably, somewhere in the Roman Empire. Okay, they were all out of town. Vishamu kol hamona shel Romi miplatya barachuk me'eva esr mil. And they heard the sound of Romans from the city of Plata, Puteoli, wherever that is, which is 120 mil, a long ways from where they were. Everyone started crying to hear Romans celebrating. And guess what? Rabbi Akiva Mesachik. Again, they asked each other. Look at these goyim, these non-Jews, these heathens that are bowing down to idols. They're serving avodah zarah. They're having all their parties, Yoshvin Betach v'Hashket, and they're all seemingly peaceful and tranquil in their capital city. The Anu Beis Hadom Raglei Eloheinu Saruf, and us, our Beis Hamikdash is burnt, right? No thanks to them. Below Nifka, and we're not going to cry. I mean, that's a no-brainer. Amalahen says Rabbi Akiva Lakachani Mitzachik. That is exactly why I am laughing. Umala over Eretzono Kach. You know why I'm laughing? Because similar to the last Gemara, yes, all these good things that you're hearing from them, the fact that they're having fun and they're celebrating and they're enjoying their life, is that they are taking advantage of their reward now. It's for the few good Maisim Tovim that they did. So they are getting their reward now, but they'll be doomed later. So Umala over Ritzono Kach, Lose Ritzono Alachas Kama V'Kama. So to the wicked, they're rewarded. Could you imagine those rewards, right, to come? Okay, so again, he's looking at the future, right? If you want to kind of analyze this, he's looking at the future while the other rabbis are looking at the present and or the past. They're not looking, right? They're not looking in the crystal ball as Rabbi Akiva is. And this is the famous story that everyone knows. Right, when they were back in Israel after Rome, they went up to Harat Sofim and they did Kriya. Kivin Shigil Harabayas, Rabbi Shul Shiyotzim Beis Kachim Kachim Yitzchilu Hen Bochen Rabbi Akiva Mitzachik. Amrulo Mipnei Matan Mitzachik, Amrulo Mipnei Matan Bochim. Same back and forth. Amrulo Makom Shakasabo Bazar Kreb Yumas. Right, the pasuk says that a non-Kohen, if you come close, is going to die. We see foxes and the Lo Nivke. This is like one of the most depressing scenes you could imagine. Rabbi Akiva answers and says, okay, so he brings a pasuk about the nevuah of Zechariah, and what does Zechariah have to do with Uriah? Uriah ben Migdash Rishon, Zechariah ben Migdash Sheni, Ela Talakas and Zechariah ben Nevuah Shel Uriah. Right, the two psukim regarding the prophecy of Zechariah is dependent on the prophecy of Uriah. Uriah, right? Sion will be plowed as a field, okay, and Yerushalayim will be made a rubble. Zechariah says that the men and the women and the right will be sitting in Yerushalayim. So ad shalom niskayim nevuah shel Uriah haiti misyar shalom niskayim nevuah shel Zechariah. It's almost like you need the bad to come and get it over with and then move on, right? Up until the nevuah of Uriah, right, didn't happen. Now, right, that he saw the prophecy of Uriah, that you have to have a destruction, right? Up until he saw that, he was afraid that Zechariah's prophecy wouldn't be fulfilled, okay? As the two of them are linked together. But now that the prophecy of Uriah was fulfilled, because he saw that Sion was a Sadeh Techaresh, was a desolate, right, place of destruction, now you could build on and move on, right, and go weiter, as they say. Okay, so that's the second story of Rabbi Akiva, and that's kind of the the clincher where we see where Rabbi Akiva holds true to his half glass full and don't look at destruction, see what could come through this. Now there's a very interesting sugya that I wanted to end off with that actually, I'll say, intersects with this, and that is the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, the beginning of Pirkei Avos, says okay, so what does it have to do with this? Well, again, if I don't know how to react, if I don't know how to act, and I could either, getting back to Bava Basra, include the easement to the water well, or not include it, says Rabbi Akiva, I'd include it because he's generous, he's optimistic, he is dan l'kav zchus. Okay, if you look at, by the way, let me just open up. That's a very misunderstood line about dan kol chaver l'kav zchus, because when does it apply? So if you look at the Bartanura, the Bartanura says, if I'm hanging and I'm like, I have 50% of me thinks that this guy is doing something wrong, 50% of me thinks he's doing something right? We just don't know. He did something. I have no idea what he really meant. So midas chasidus hiladon l'kav zchus. Aval adam shehuchtak barasha. But if we're talking about a bad dude, mutar ladon l'chova, then we don't play this game of he's just right. We're just misunderstanding. No, he did something wrong. We don't have to go bend over backwards, right, to tell us that this guy's really doing something right. Mutar ladon l'chova. Shlo amru ela hachoshed b'kshem loka begufo. Because when is it a problem to be choshed someone who's a kosher? Like we learned the Gemara and Shabbos learns that from Moshe, right? Moshe was choshed b'nei Yisrael, and he got punished, right? He got saras when he put his hand in his pocket in Parashat Shmos, right? But someone who's choshed b'rasha is not local. Okay, so that's the one important thing. What does it have to do with Rabbi Akiva, though? So just to end the cap tonight, I want to read a Gemara in the Seches Shabbos, Tav Kuf Chav Zayin. Okay, says the Gemara. Now the Mishnah said, "Danas kol chaver l'kav zchus." The Gemara doesn't talk about it in many places. There's two references in Shas. One is the pasuk in the Gemara in Shavuos, Tav Lamed, that talks about the tzedek tishbor amitecha. And the second is a Gemara that I'm about to quote from Shabbos, Tav Kuf Chav Zayin. Amar Ravasi Amar Rav Yochanan, Shisha Dvarim Adam Ochel Peirosein B'Olam Hazeh V'Keren Kayemes L'Olam Haba. Okay, this sounds like the beginning of Peah. Ve'elu hen achnasas orchin, bikur cholim, ve'iyun tefila, whatever that means, not for now. V'hashkamas beis hamidrash, v'hamagad l'banav l'talmud Torah. So far, so good. V'hadanas chaver l'kav zchus. Wow. Okay, Danas Kaber L'Kav Zchus makes up the big six things that your Ochel Peiros B'Olam Hazeh V'Keren Kayemes L'Olam Haba. That's a really, really nice statement. Okay, says the Gemara on the next page, Kuf Chav Zayin Amud Beis. Okay, Tanu Rabbanan Hadan Chaver L'Kav Zchus Danan Otol L'Zchus. If you judge someone l'kav zchus, then you yourself will be judged l'kav zchus. There was one person, one time, who went to Galil Elyon, okay? V'niskar etzel balabayis. He worked for a certain owner, Bidarom, in the south. Shalosh shanim. For 3 years, the person worked. Erev Yom HaKippurim Amarlo, after 3 years on Erev Yom Kippur, the person wanted to go back home. Amarlo, tell me schari ve'elach ve'ezonas ishti. I've been working a very long time. I'd like to get paid. All right, reasonable request. Amar lo, ein limos. I'm sorry, says the owner. Right now, I don't have cash. Amar lo, ten li peiros. So the worker said, okay, pay me in fruit. Amar lo, ein li, I got no fruit. Ten li karka, pay me in real estate. Ein li, I have no real estate. Ten li behema, give me an animal that's worth something. Ein li, tough luck. Ten li kara muksasos, give me blankets and pillows. Ein li, out of it. I am bankrupt, says the Balabayas. Depressing story. Hifshel Kalev Lachorav. So he slung his kalim in back of his back. He goes home all depressed. La'achar haregel. After Sukkot, remember this happened Erev Yom Kippur, right? He came home for Yom Kippur, broke. After Sukkot, Natal Balabayas Charabiyado. The Balabayas got money in the next week or so, and he went and he visited Rabbi Akiva, and he bought v'imo masoy gimel chamorim, echad shel machal v'echad shel mishte v'echad shel minei megadim. 3 donkeys. One had food, one had drink, and one had candy, sweets. By the way, these 3 same camel, I have to look into this, because these 3 donkeys are exactly mentioned by the story of, anybody know? This is the Nachamish Gamzu story. I got to look into this because they're related, right? Nachamish Gamzu also had this. That was right when he wanted to get off his donkey, and he took time, and that's why he cursed himself, because the poor person died. These are the same kind of animals that he had over there. Anyways, so what happened was, so this person went to his home, to Rabbi Akiva. This person went v'halach lo lebeso. Amar sha'achlu v'shatu nasan lo scharo. Amar lo b'shasha amarti lo. So he gave this worker food. He gave him what he owed him. So now the Balabai felt very bad, and he wanted to settle the score with this guy. So Amar lo, so the Balabai has told the worker, said, listen, please be honest with me. B'shasha amarti li. When you told me, tell li schari v'amar ein li mos v'mecha shadani. When I told you that I was broke, I had no cash, what did you think I meant? Amarti, so the worker said, Shema prakmati bezul nizdam alecha. You know what I really thought? I thought that you had possibly, but someone approached you with a great deal in business, and you took all your cash and you spent it on that deal. Ubishasha amarti l'ten, and he said, okay. So the Balabai said, when I told you, when you asked for an animal, and I couldn't even give you an animal as payment, what did you think of me? But maybe you had an animal, but you had it hired out to someone else. When I told you I had no real estate to give you, what did you really think? Amarti, so he said, Shema mucheres bi'ad acherimi. Maybe it was leased to someone else. Ubishasha amarti lacha ein li peiros. And when I said, I have no fruit even to pay you, what did you really think of me? Amarti Shema ein museres. Maybe you had peiros, but true men Maisa weren't taken from them. So therefore you could give it to me as payment. When I said that I couldn't even give you blankets and pillows, what did you really think of me? I said, you know what? If you have absolutely nothing, it means that you're such a tzaddik that you were makdish all your stuff to the Beis HaMikdash. You're the ultimate benevolent person. Amrullah, here's the punchline. Ha'avoda kachaya. He says, wow, you're 4 for 4. The Balabaya says, everything you said is true. Higdish kol kachaya hidarti kol nechsai b'shvil Hurkanus b'ni. You know why I had nothing? Because my son Hurkanus shalo asak b'Torah. I made a neder against him, okay, because he wasn't learning Torah. By the way, can you do that? Maybe we'll have a share on that, whether that's the right thing to do or not. If you have a son that doesn't learn Torah, what are you allowed to do? Hitiruli kol nidarai. Then my whole neder was made annulled when I went to the south before I came to visit you, and now I have what to pay you with. And just like you were dan lekav schus, right? When it came to me, so too you should be judged also lekav schus. Now, how does this Gemara start? So here's the punchline. The punchline is the Chedushe Chasam Sofer. What does he say? Says the Chedushe Chasam Sofer, Ayin Chuvas Ramu Mipanu, Shekasu B'Shem She'iltos, to Oso Balabayas. So who's the man of the hour? Who's this masked man who was Dan Lekav Schus? Haya Oso Balabayas Haya Rabbi Lezer ben Horkanus. The man in the story, because he already hinted that his son's name was Horkanus. So this man was Rabbi Elazar ben Horkanus, and who was the worker? Who was the worker who said that everything, right? That the reason why he's not paying me is for a good reason, right? And he took one for the team and he went home empty-handed. Sacher haya Rabbi Akiva. The Sacher was Rabbi Akiva, Kishahaya Am Haaretz. When he was still in Am Haaretz. These are the years before he was 40. Right? The cause of Mizeh Yesh Lahavin Shagam Kishahaya Am Haaretz. Haya Balmidos Tovos. And what's the real punchline of the story? This isn't the Rabbi Akiva when he was famous, when he was post 40. This is the Rabbi Akiva pre-40. Mizeh Yesh Lahavin Shagam Kishahaya Am Haaretz Haya Balmidos Tovos. Shadan L'Schus Kol Kachas Abalabayis. This is the story even before. So could you imagine after, when Rabbi Akiva became what he became? So I thought that these two intersecting concepts of Kol David Rahman L'Tav Avid and Danas Chaber L'Kav Schus all involve the same protagonist, who is the opinion in our Mishnah about a seemingly obscure halacha about selling your home, and why is it that your path to lead to your water you have to buy back because you were such a good guy when you sold it. And on that note, we will end. Questions?